Will you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I am a poor, wayfaring stranger, traveling through this world of woe. But there's no sickness, toil, or danger in that bright land to which I go. From God we were born, and to God we die. Our lives are a pilgrimage from God to God. I think that might be on. You want to try reading it as we play with all this? The ancient Israelites were accustomed to this practice of pilgrimage. And Psalm 84 that Kirk read for us is a song they sang on their pilgrimage to the Jerusalem temple. How lovely is your dwelling place, O God. My soul longs, indeed it faints, for the courts of the Lord. Better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere. I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than live in the tents of wickedness. The temple was sacred to the Hebrew people because it was the place where God's presence came to dwell. Now, God was not confined to the temple. From time to time, God did appear in other places like a burning bush or a mountaintop. But for ancient Israel, God's presence was in the temple in a special, focused way. If people wanted to meet with God, to spend time with God, they didn't go for a hike in the mountains or a walk through the desert. They met God at the temple. And on the high holy days, everyone would gather at the temple. The people made a pilgrimage to meet with their God. And as they journeyed the way to Jerusalem, they would sing. And so we have songs like Psalm 84, an ode to the temple, a song to sing on the way to God's house. Now, we don't know who wrote this song, but when I hear it, I can't help but think of those Hebrew people in exile. You remember from this summer, right? The Babylonian exile, where Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed and the people deported to a foreign land. My soul longs, indeed it faints, for the courts of the Lord, sings the psalmist. And I wonder if maybe this singer who longs and faints is one of those exiles who is homesick, not just for their land and their own house, but for the beauty and joy they found in the house of God. Or maybe it was written by someone like Ezra and Nehemiah. Remember, we heard from them this summer, from Haggai or Zechariah, the ones who came home after the exile and built the temple again. Maybe they had a newfound appreciation for the privilege of visiting God's house after they'd been away for so long. Maybe they were the ones who sang as with renewed strength as they marched toward the temple with shouts and tambourines. Happy are those who live in your house, O God, ever singing your praise. We in our stewardship season are building God's house, building this house as we raise money for our operating budget and for the $135,000 capital campaign for new roofs, etc. And our souls too have come to long and to faint for the house of God. There's something holy about being in this space again, isn't there? There's something about being together, something that feels like coming home. Even especially after a year of our own sort of exile from this sacred space, this building that we have come to call the house of God. Now, to be sure, we are Presbyterians, and Reformed Christians do not believe that God is confined to any one building. The church is one of many places we encounter God. For the God who created the world and called it good is present in all of God's good creation. Like I said last week, the pandemic taught us that in desperate times, our temple is not actually essential. Church can take place outside of the building. And thanks be to God for that. And yet, there is something special about being in this place, isn't there? About being together in this way. There's something sacred about coming into God's house, something that feels like home. I grew up in another First Presbyterian church. We're very creative with our naming. First Presbyterian Church in Richmond, Virginia. And when I say I grew up there, I don't just mean I was raised as part of that family of faith. I mean that when I look back on my childhood, I feel like I literally grew up in that building. I spent more time in that church building than anywhere else except school and maybe my house. There was worship, children's choir, youth choir, bell choir, Wednesday night supper, youth group, Sunday school meetings, parents meetings where we're hanging out in the nursery, being the kids, watching the kids, lock-ins, the list goes on. We were there so much that at some point the adult leaders had to pull a group of us aside and give us a rather stern talking to stop using the boiler room as our secret hideout. Turns out it's a liability to have teenagers hanging out in your heating system. Now, why did I spend all that time in the church? I can assure you it is not because I was a particularly pious teenager. I wasn't. And it's not even that the church made me feel spiritual in some way or close to God. 13-year-old Ginna did not really care about any of that. No, the best way I know how to describe it is this. The church felt like home. I was comfortable there. I was safe there. People knew me and they called me by name. They asked how I was doing, and they actually stopped and listened and cared about the answer. Church was family. When I didn't know where else to go, I could always go home. Our life is a pilgrimage from God to God. And the church, God's house, is a stop along the way. There's one verse in Psalm 84 that simply delights me. It's verse 5. The psalmist writes, "Happy are those whose strength is in you, in whose heart are the highways to Zion." Did you hear that? The highways to Zion are in our hearts. There is a map inscribed upon our very souls that knows the way home. We are on a pilgrimage from God to God. Our hearts know the way, and they lead us to stop here at the temple, the church, at God's house. I think maybe we stop here at God's house because it gives us a preview of coming attractions, a foretaste of home. This is our little oasis, our place to stop and rest along the pilgrimage of life, where we remember who we are and whose we are. We remember where we've come from and where we are going. We remember why we are here, what we are doing, and that our only comfort in life and in death is that we belong, body and soul, to our faithful Savior, Jesus Christ. And you know what? First Presbyterian Church of Taos, it's not just us. Yes, we the congregation, we call this church home, and we should. But there are people all over this community who also know this place to be home. Members of AA, NA, Al-Anon, other 12-step groups, the Taos Community Chorus, members of the Girl Scouts or of PFLAG or Big Brothers, Big Sisters, people who also say, oh, First Presbyterian Church, I'm there all the time. That place is home for me. We in the Taos, we're all on these different journeys, different pilgrimages of life and faith. And yet, for all of us, this place feels like home. So, why build God's house? Because we are on a pilgrimage from God to God. Because those holy maps written on our hearts, our deepest longings to be close to God and one another, keep bringing us back here, back to the church. We build God's house because on this pilgrim journey, we need a place to stop, rest, remember. We need somewhere that feels like home. I'm going to see my mother. I'm going to roll. I'm just a going over Jordan. I'm just a going over home. Thanks be to the God who fills these walls. Amen.